Okay, good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to today's Irish Studies Research Seminar here from Queen's University, Belfast. We have a number of people here in the room with us, and also quite a few of you out there joining us through Teams. You're very welcome, whichever mode you're using. If you are joining us online, just a reminder to keep yourselves muted, just so we don't get feedback. And also, just to let you know as well, we are recording this session, so if you don't want to appear on the recording inadvertently, you just need to turn your camera off and then you'll be quite safe. There'll be an opportunity so without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. Get him on camera here. There we are. Professor Frank Shovlin is a professor of Irish literature in English at the University of Liverpool, where he's taught since the year 2000. He's a native of the west of Ireland and was educated at University College Galway before moving to St John's College, Oxford, to complete his DPhil under the supervision of Tom Paulin. He has researched and published widely in modern Irish literature, including, including the Irish Literary Periodical, 1923 to 58, published by Oxford in 2004. Journey Westward, Joyce, Dubliners and the Literary Revival, published by Liverpool in 2012. And his recent work is focused on John McGahern. He published a monograph, Touchstones, John McGahern's Classical Style, in 2016. And his edition of John McGahern's Letters was published by Faber and Faber in September of this year, and indeed he's currently working on the authorised biography of McGahern. So it's a great pleasure that we invite Frank to speak to us this afternoon about his recent project on John McGahern's Letters. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Frank and we'll get the slides up for you. So if you can't see the slides, please just shout out, unmute yourself and let us know.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Cannot see slides.
Can't see the slides. Okay, sorry, we'll just...
Nor can we see the picture of you or the speaker.
Just bear with us and we'll relaunch the presentation. Okay, so we've relaunched the slides, so hopefully people can see them now.
I can see the slides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Still cannot.
Okay, everybody, thanks for coming along, and hello to everybody who's out there in the wide world. So this book, The Letters of John McGahern, was published by Faber in September of this year. And it was a book that I first began to think about in July of 2014, when John McGahern's widow, Madeleine, approached me and we had lunch, and she knew that I was working on a separate book to do with her late husband. And we talked about the possibility of my editing the letters, and we agreed that I would try. And it was contracted to Faber in January of 2015. And I began work in earnest on the book. So it's a large book. As you can see, some of you perhaps have it already. It's including the index, it comes to 850 pages. The manuscript that I submitted was about 256,000 words, about 1,200 letters and over 2,000 footnotes. About 70% of the book was written by John McGahern and about 30% was written by me. I can say without fear of contradiction, it's a very interesting book. given that it was written mainly by one of Ireland's greatest writers. And I think that comes through again and again, the quality of the writing, whatever about my parts. How did I get here? I've been working on John McGahern for at least 10 years now. I was an undergraduate in Galway back in the early 1990s. John McGahern taught me there in the spring of 1993 in a small seminar group about the size of the group in this room now. I had studied McGahern right from my first year in a course on the Irish short story, and we'd read a story called Gold Watch, which had really blown me away. Perhaps it gripped me more than any other piece of fiction I'd ever read. There was something about it, something about its power that I found quite remarkable. And that power has never gone away for me in McGahern's work. I've always found it fascinating and superb, and still do. So I taught on a McGahern summer school that used to run in Ballinamore and Carrick back around 08, 09, 10. Published a short essay on one of McGahern's stories, The Wine Breath, in which I argued that Yeats was the big influence behind certain ideas in The Wine Breath, and in particular Yeats's poem, All Souls' Night. That then started me thinking about other writers that were present in McGahern and his work. And that led to me getting some funding from the Leverhulme Trust to work in Galway for a year amongst McGahern's papers in the academic year 12-13. That then led to the publication of Touchstones, my monograph with Liverpool University Press in 2016. Since then, I've published a short pamphlet, John McGahern's Dublin, with the Dublin City Libraries. It was the annual Gilbert Lecture, which I gave there just before the pandemic hit. It was the last public event I did pre-pandemic, late January 2020. And this, John McGahern's Dublin, was published in January 2021. All this time, since 2014, of course, I've been working on the letters also, and now that's complete. And just last month, I signed with Faber to write the authorized biography. Who is John McGahern? I'm guessing everybody knows, but I'll very quickly tell you anyway. Born in 1934, died in 2006. Often seen as Ireland's most important fiction writer after Beckett and Joyce. Shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1990 for his novel Amongst Women. Published 6 novels in total, 3 standalone collections of short stories, a play, I guess he's best known for his novels and his short stories. And I think that he's been enormously influential on the generation of Irish writers after him. Whether that be Claire Keegan or Kevin Barry, Colm Tobin, all of these writers are very open in their love for McGahern's work and when they talk about the influence that he's had on them. The 2 photographs here, the one on the left is of McGahern in Madeleine's Paris flat in 1969. He was writing the stories that were becoming Nightlines at this point, his first collection of stories. And the picture on the right is of McGahern in the late 1990s in his home in Foxfield, County Leitrim, a small cottage that he and Madeleine bought in the early 1970s and slowly improved over the years, becoming their comfortable family home, and it's where he spent the rest of his life. Although one of the things that you'll know from the letters if you've been using them is that he traveled a great deal more than I think most people realized. He lived for long periods in the US, in England, in France, and in Ireland. The letters are scattered all over the world. I was fortunate when I started in that Madeleine had a number of letters, hundreds of letters I would say, in Foxfield, in the house. Some of these letters had been sent back by people that John had written to after he died. It sent back runs of letters. John never saved his own letters that went out. He never copied a letter, and he wasn't writing on a laptop or he wasn't sending. He was towards the very end of his life sending emails, but the letters were not consciously saved. The letters out. The letters in were consciously saved, so that was very helpful. So I was able, for instance, to see the letters he had received from Brian Friel, from Seamus Heaney, from Paul Muldoon, and other friends. And then I was, having seen those, I was able to go out then and hunt for the letters that he had sent. In this case here, this illustration, this letter is in Indiana, in the University of Indiana. It's part of the X papers. X was a literary magazine in London that ran for 7 issues between 1959 and 61. A quarterly, very high quality quarterly, edited by an Irish artist called Patrick or Paddy Swift, and a South African called David Wright. And it was here that McGahern was first published. How did that happen? Well, McGahern had met Paddy Swift's brother Tony in a dance hall in O'Connell Street in 1956 or 7. And the first adult letter in the book is to Tony Swift. Tony Swift was from a large Dublin family. Paddy Swift was a brother, and a man called Jimmy, or James Swift, was another brother. James Swift, Jimmy, became McGahern's closest confidant in the late 1950s and early 1960s. McGahern was working as a primary school teacher in Clontarf, and he would meet Jimmy Swift every Friday night in the Stag's Head pub in Dame Lane in Dublin, and they would talk about art and the world, literature. It was Jimmy Swift who first introduced McGahern to Proust, who encouraged him to study Auden. And he was, I would say, the single most important aesthetic influence on McGahern over the course of his life. And John dedicates his first novel, The Barracks, to James Swift. So Jimmy encouraged John to send an extract of a novel to Paddy for consideration for publication in X. John sent it, and Paddy liked it, and it was published in spring 1961, and thus started his literary career. Just one other thing about this image, you can see here, the handwriting is really quite nice here. It's quite readable, cursive, neat. It soon falls apart and becomes more difficult to read. So, for instance, here's a much later letter from 1992 to Colm Tóibín. It's still readable, and there weren't many words that I found illegible over the course of my reading. Very few of the letters are typed. John did not like typing, and he didn't type his own manuscripts. In the early days, he got them professionally typed, and after he met Madeline, Madeline typed all of the handwritten manuscripts. So here's this later letter to Colm Tóibín. Colm Tóibín was able to supply me with about 30 letters that John had sent to him over the years. I think they're very interesting letters. I mean, I think one of the notable things about them is that the kind of common thread that runs through them is McGahern more or less constantly criticizing Tóibín's writing, saying it's not quite good enough, basically. And saying, well, I like this bit, but I really didn't like this bit, or you shouldn't have done this. And telling him all the time that his best book is his book about the border, which isn't fiction at all, as you'll know. So they're very interesting, and Colm Tóibín was very good of him to let me see them, and I think he found this kind of funny, actually, the level to which he's criticized by this great master, who he unequivocally admired. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to look at a few individual letters to give you a taste of some of the themes and moments in McGahern's life that are illustrated by the letters. In some quarters, what McGahern is still most famous for is The Banning of the Dark in 1965. The Dark was his second novel. It's the first novel that I'm aware of to talk about clerical sexual abuse in Ireland. The young boy of the novel is abused by his father. He's abused by a priest. And he comes to a kind of sexual quite graphic sexual awakening over the course of the novel. The novel was immediately banned, but under the Censorship of Publications Act, and as a result of that, McGahern was fired from his job in a Catholic boys' primary school and was essentially all but exiled to London. Exile is perhaps too strong a word. You know, no one said you've got to leave the country, but he wasn't going to get a job in Ireland again anytime soon. So off he goes to London and works as a supply teacher in the East End of London for a number of years. This letter is to his American editor, Patrick Gregory at Knopf. His first novel, The Barracks, had been published by Macmillan in New York. In Britain, it was Faber all the way. Faber were his publishers right throughout his life. His American publishing history is patchy and difficult, except at the very end when he returns to Knopf and has a very happy relationship with the editor Sonny Mehta for what we call memoir, and That They May Face the Rising Sun. His first novel, The Barracks, published by Macmillan in the US in 1964. So naturally, he sends the manuscript of The Dark to Macmillan again in New York, and their chief editor was a man called Cecil Scott. Scott hated the book so much that he wrote to McGahern, McGahern's agent, and Faber, telling them not to publish the book, that it was disgusting, that he said it makes the skin creep, and it would damage McGahern for it to be published. Luckily, Faber paid no notice, published the book, and it became the last great cause célèbre of Irish censorship. So here he's writing to Knopf, pick up the book in the US, and his editor there is Patrick Gregory, and it's a very interesting run of letters to Gregory in Galway. Dear Patrick, it's a long and mostly boring story. I'll try to shorten it. The 8th of May telegram to phone them. It was to tell me not to come. I didn't telephone and presented myself for work. They were very afraid, the teachers. The headmaster read me a note that I was suspended until the priest interviewed me. This would have to be after the 6th of November, end of his holidays. I then saw the union. They were willing to fight sacking on the grounds of dark, but not on a civil marriage. He had got married to a Finnish woman in a registry office in Helsinki in November 1964. Naturally, that marriage was not recognised by the Catholic Church as a valid marriage. He would have to have been married in a Catholic church. I do not think I could go through the farce of a ceremony, cage Anu here, bow my head, work humbly for them, and live with myself and work with myself. Anu doesn't want to go through with it either, and she doesn't want to live in Dublin, which I want. But it seems impossible. It seems it must be the woman's land of London. So I meet Anu in London tomorrow. We'll decide over the days what to do. I'll then go to see the priest after November the 6th and probably get sacked. Nothing now can affect my work. It grows only more clear, this journey into my changing self in search of style. But physically and financially, it cannot be as easy in London as it was, but that only lies down beside the first. And so off he goes to London, and he enters a quite unhappy period in his life of not writing, of scrabbling around for work, and his marriage is not working out either. His wife, Anniki Laxi, is a Finnish theatre director and translator. Her work, a lot of her work is in Finland. He doesn't like Helsinki, she doesn't like Dublin rather. So London is this kind of middle ground that doesn't really fully work for either of them. But despite that trouble and the banning of the dark and the writer's block and losing his job, he goes on to have a very successful career as a writer, as we know. Novelist, short story writer, Booker Prize shortlisted, Amongst Women turned into a 4-part BBC show. His last books, That They May Face the Rising Sun and memoir, selling, as does Amongst Women, in huge numbers, both in Ireland and elsewhere. He becomes a famous man. He becomes a famous public figure. And in the last years of his life, I think more and more, he's a public figure in Ireland. He becomes a member of the Arts Council Board. And that kind of hermetical figure that I think we were used to from the 60s and 70s becomes a much more open, public-facing figure. Now, want to go back a little bit to one of the early letters. And this letter relates to his family life in County Roscommon. His mother died when he was 9. She was a school teacher, a national school teacher, at the time in a place called Archival, County Leitrim, near Ballinamore. And after her death, her 7 children, including John, who was her eldest, moved in with their father, who's a Garda sergeant in Coot Hall, County Roscommon. This is a photograph of the family here. This is Sergeant McGahern, Sergeant Frank McGahern in the background. He was a veteran of the Anglo-Irish War, pro-treaty, joined the Guards, a difficult, violent character. And the figure of the dissatisfied revolutionary is at the heart of Amongst Women and in many of the stories. And John was the eldest. There was the youngest was the little boy standing in front of him is Frankie, the youngest in the family. He had twin sisters, so he had 5 sisters. And this, I suspect, is a communion day of his twin sisters, Breed and Rosalind, first communion. Dipna is this little girl here, his youngest sister. And he's writing to her here. This is undated. It's around about 1959-60, I think. And he's advising her about what to do with her life. And I think it's very revealing of life as he believes it ought to be lived. You should try to come to terms with the people about you and with your work. If you can't endure them, find devices to avoid them, or to see as little of them as possible, or to get clear of them altogether. If you dislike your work, set about getting another kind of work. To do any of these things, you'll have to discipline yourself and work. There is no such thing in life as freedom, only the freedom to choose, and that not always. And our choices impose their own tyrannies on us. And only a person who fails, who gives everything up as hopeless, can become wooden. Lamb didn't let the wood get into his soul. This is a reference to Charles Lamb's essay, The Superannuated Man, which is about the drudgery of office work and the joy, hopefully, of retirement. How could one piece of wood say that an office makes people into other pieces of wood? Only a thinking person could recognize such a thing. I, at least, have no wish to be a lily of the field. I would not want to be a lesser thing than I am. I can, by discipline and honesty and work, be greater. To give up is to go in the direction of the lily or the piece of wood or the pig. To lose our consciousness or our souls. It is only because your mind has some idea of beauty that a lily is more so than a pig. I was glad to know that you are reading. Read many books. Not until you have read many books, bad ones and good ones, will you know what you want. And always read what you enjoy. Now that you are young, read several and many books, because even now the time is slipping away from you that leaves a lasting impression on your life. Until you have read many books, do not have too many opinions about them, because it is only by comparison that books, no more than most things, are good and bad. But ask yourself sometime if this or that has anything to do with your own life. Is it your idea of truth or of beauty? A couple of things about that letter. First of all, his own life in books. He was creating a life for himself out of books and out of reading. A kind of self-taught life. And certain writers became key to his vision of the world. W.B. Yeats foremost amongst them. But I think also here we see the emergence of McGahern's love for the poet Rilke. And Rilke's letters to a young poet, in which Rilke advises a young person how to live, how to avoid the mistakes that he has made. I think that's what John McGahern's trying to do here for his sister. And he felt a burden, I think, to try and get his siblings out from under their father and out into the world. Dipna moved to Dublin and then onwards to London. And his letters to Dipna, I think, are amongst his best. Moving on to his writing career. and to Charles Monteith. Charles Monteith was his editor at Faber. When X published the extract from the novel, and the novel was called The End or the Beginning of Love, X published an extract. The novel was never published. He was offered a contract for the novel by a firm called Barry and Rockcliffe. He decided not to publish it. Almost as soon as the extract was published, Charles Monteith wrote an unsolicited letter to him asking to see more work. This was a very exciting moment for any young writer. The most glamorous literary firm in London, Faber, seeking to see your work. He sent them a few thousand words of what was becoming the Barracks, or at the time it was called the Grindstone. And they liked it and they offered him a contract. And he never looked back. Monteith was a very interesting character from Lisburn, a student at Inst, and then he went on to Oxford. He went to Magdalen College, Oxford, a star there. He gets called up to fight in the Second World War, fights in the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers in Burma, gets injured, rises to the rank of major, returns to Oxford after the war, becomes a Fellow of All Souls, and joins Faber as a result of his friendship with Geoffrey Faber. A brilliant talent spotter. Almost from the start, he repaid Faber by discovering in a pile of abandoned manuscripts the book that goes on to become The Lord of the Flies by William Golding, which sells 22 million copies and gets ultimately Golding Nobel Prize for Literature. So he's enormously successful as a talent spotter. He sees McGahern, he brings Seamus Heaney into Faber, etc., etc. So this is McGahern's very first letter to Charles Monteith. The picture, by the way, I'm sorry for its quality, but it's of William Golding getting the Nobel Prize, Golding on the right, Monteith on the left. So Monteith had written to John on the 14th of March via X, and John writes back to him. Thank you for your letter of the 14th of March concerning the extracts that appeared in X. It is the first novel that was actually accepted for publication, but by then I could not in conscience publish it without serious revision. The pieces in X are part of the revision. In the revising, another novel evolved which owed nothing to the first. I felt I must leave the revision aside for a time and finish and try to publish this new work. The publishers do not seem to like this delaying, and I am not happy with the position. I sent the first part of this new work to the editors of X, who have just written to say that they consider it a real advance and exciting. Whether this opening, 13,000 words or so, would be too slight for you to make me an offer or not, I do not know. If you consider it possible, I could let you see a copy. I hope this does not seem all confusion. I am not bound by any contract or agreement. Naturally, the idea of you publishing me is enormously attractive. And so begins the relationship with Faber. McGahern likes Monteith, they get on well. He eventually fictionalizes Monteith in his final novel as the character Robert Booth, the gentlemanly London publisher. Since I'm in Belfast, I want to say a little bit about his relationship with Michael McClaverty. Michael McClaverty, the Belfast school teacher, became an important correspondent of McGahern's. The McClaverty papers, as many of you will know, are in the Linen Hall Library here, and I went to consult them on a couple of occasions while I was working on the book. And it's a very interesting relationship. I mean, McGahern writes McClaverty a fan letter, the only fan letter I'm aware of that he ever wrote in 1959. And they start this correspondence. I like this letter because it reflects a really interesting aspect of McGahern's character. He writes this letter to McClaverty after he wins the AE Memorial Award, which is a prize for writers under the age of 35 for an unfinished piece of work. No prose writer had ever won it before. It had always gone to poets. Monteith suggested to McGahern he enter for the prize, and McGahern won the prize, much to his surprise. And the week or two afterwards, he writes to McClaverty about how he felt about that. For a little while, the morning it came, I was excited as a schoolboy with the award. And then afterwards, there was the blank, inscrutable face of my work that knows nothing of awards or rewards, but only faith and passion and suffering and the long availability which we call work will move. The most gladness my success, if so little can be called that, has brought, apart from my friend's sake, is to affirm in my bones that all success and failure are private. What happens outside that are either lucky or unlucky accidents, for all art approaches prayer. McGahern was losing his faith at this point, and he abandoned the Catholic Church, not because of the banning of the dark, but he simply sorry, this machine is playing tricks on us. He was very insistent on the idea that art was very similar to prayer, and that art had a religious nature. Sorry, that's fine. Okay, just Belfast. A couple of things about Belfast since I'm here. We know that McGahern applied for a job in Stranmillis College, which he didn't get. We also know that he gave a very interesting lecture in the Whitla Hall, which I went to have a look at earlier on, in November 1967 on the subject of Herman Melville's short story Bartleby the Scrivener, which was a great favourite of his. And he says in a slightly later letter to McClaverty, no, sorry, it's an earlier letter from 1961. He's arranging to visit McClaverty in Belfast. He says about Belfast, if the date has a meaning for you, the town has for me. For I spent one of the most dreadful weeks of my life there at 17, desperately in love and with only my paltry 17 years to offer. I've even a kind of a dread going, though I always laugh when I think of Belfast. I don't know who the girl was, and it surprises me. It doesn't make any sense to me. It really, I mean, if anyone knows out there, I'm interested in hearing. This was a boy from County Leitrim, County Roscommon. He was in school in Carrick and Shannon, all boys school. How does a 17-year-old boy in North Roscommon meet a girl who he wants to hang out with for a week in Belfast? How did his dad let him go? Doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, it's one of many mysteries that I couldn't answer over the course of the letters. Okay, I'll move on. This letter shows a much more confident McGahern. Here he's writing to one of the most powerful people in the American publishing scene, Peter Davison, the poet and poetry editor at Atlantic magazine. And he's his editor. At this point, he's moved from Knopf to Atlantic to publish this collection, Nightlines. Davison sends him this proposed cover for Nightlines, and McGahern goes nuts. He's like, you're not publishing this book in this form. And you can see why. The thatched cottage, the old lady, the shawl, good old Ireland, So McGahern despised this cover and sent this very angry letter. My heart fell at the sight of the cover. 1, impression, a schoolgirl's book. 2, a chocolate green or green chocolate of a pig in the kitchen. My prose stands against everything the cover says. Surely Yeats, Joyce and Beckett gave Irish letters some universal dignity. I might let it pass if I thought it would find its readers. My experience is that people likely to buy a book are people who enjoy the language. A cover like that is the same as selling cheese under a sugar label. That hankering after the little old homestead is played out. Grove have no need of it. The cover is lazy, unimaginative, and it stereotypes. Since whoever designed it thought it a cliche, a long dead one at that. Why can't it just get decent type and red and black if nothing can be better thought of? That cover is death to the book. Gregory wouldn't have let it through. I don't want to hear the viciousness in his laugh when he sees it. And you as a poet as well as a publisher must be able to see it's a disaster. That kind of Irish cover has been literally played to death and is as dead as the literature it symbolised. Lovely mists that do be rising on the bog. top of the morning. I'll be back at 1 Rue Christine on the 1st of October. Can you write to me? Forgive any mistakes. I am disturbed. And he gets his way. He gets his way. Atlantic published Nightlines in the US under quite a plain cover with the word Nightlines repeated in 4 times. But you can see it's a very different McGahern to the kind of slightly hesitant McGahern we saw writing to his sister earlier on. This is a man who knows his position, and I think he's got 2 novels under his belt with Faber. He's been winning Arts Council bursaries, and he's willing to go out on a limb and in terms of his attack on that book. Jumping on. I really put this one in because it's an interesting story. Who's Joe Kennedy? I found Joe Kennedy's name in 1 letter. And I was visiting Madeleine McGahern in Foxfield for a few days, asking her hundreds of questions. This was how I generally worked. I'd save up questions and I'd go there, I'd ask her hundreds of questions over a few days. And she'd be able to answer most of them. I said to her one day, who is Joe Kennedy? His name appears in a letter of March 1975. She said, oh, Joe Kennedy was a journalist we knew, and he was at John's funeral, but I've not seen him since. And I thought that was it. I didn't think I'd be able to get any further with it. The next day, a letter arrived from Joe Kennedy to Madeleine McGahern. She hadn't heard from him in 13 years. So that was an incredible stroke of luck. So I now had his address. I wrote to him. And I arranged to meet him in Wynn's Hotel in Dublin in September 18. And we had a chat, and then he opened up this attaché case and he took out this sheaf of papers and he said, would these be any use to you? And he presented me with 90 letters that John McGahern had written to him between 1963 and 2005. So that's a kind of researcher's dream. To the point I was actually afraid. I started photographing them as quickly as I could. But I got them, and I'm still in touch with Joe, and he's been very useful. Joe, as it happens, was the first editor of Ireland's first tabloid newspaper, the Sunday World. This is a letter that John writes to him in 1999. Joe had sent him an extract from letters between Frank O'Connor and William Maxwell, the editor at The New Yorker, a book called The Happiness of Getting It Down Right. And in it, O'Connor talks about meeting this young writer, McGahern, and he has fairly unkind things to say about this guy who won the AE prize and how he was everyone's second best, essentially. So Joe says, do you remember this? And John writes to him, the literary stuff doesn't matter. Literary reputations last as long as the body of work they represent remains useful, whether to one reader or to many, and will disappear into the long night like ourselves eventually. What matters is the spirit to which they give utterance. Like many things that come my way, that I was once part of, the enclosure is both accurate and inaccurate. I attended that party in O'Connor's flat. I went reluctantly. Elizabeth Cullinan, Betty, needed an escort. I wasn't even her boyfriend. She was in the middle of a bad love affair. It was the one time I met Frank O'Connor, and he remained in bed throughout my stay, which wasn't long. The edge to O'Connor's remark was due, I imagine, to a TV interview I gave on winning the prize. I was asked, what do you think of O'Connor and O'Faolain? It was like asking a young writer now, what do you think of Heaney and Friel? I replied blithely, I don't think about them at all, thinking with a young person's conceit that I had adroitly avoided the question. Elizabeth C. told me that O'Connor had watched the interview and I couldn't have said a worse thing. So much for conceit. I also said Beckett and Kavanagh were the 2 living Irish writers I most admired. My response was an unfair young person's response, and I would prefer it to have been different. I want to finish up now. This will be the last letter I'll look at. John was diagnosed with cancer, and at first he hoped that he had beaten the cancer. It returned, and in spring 2003, it was clear that it was terminal. He died in March 2006. So he writes this letter knowing that he is dying to a friend of his, Michael Gorman, a Sligo man who lives in Galway, a poet. I think it's a kind of beautiful letter and revealing of John's worldview. Thank you for your letter and the 2 tempting truffles and the Sligo photos. I love those old photos. They look at you out of a depth of time. But there was no dear Paddy Morahan. He would be with Sligo Rovers, and the old band seems to be in operation. There is not too much difference here, other than the adjustment to a different reality. A reality we always knew was there and unavoidable, but is still different when it comes. I used to have ways of avoiding going to the room to write, disliking the intensity and total absorption. But now I'm glad of it. It belongs more to now than when we felt free in acres of time. And that too was necessary and is. I find I have to be socially more careful. All society excludes this knowledge in order to function. There was a do for an old friend of mine, Alf Rowley, a barman in Mohill 2 years ago. He was dying and the function was to help pay bills. He lived less than a week afterwards. He had a fine singing voice, and at the end, before the soldiers' song, he rose and thanked them, and then sang, I bid you all a fond goodbye. There wasn't a stampede for the door, but it was the next best thing, and mutterings about the poor man not being in his right mind, the Leitrim way of describing a lack of tact. So I think he faced death stoically and as the inevitable that we all face, that he knew would one day come. Of course, he wished that he had longer, but once the diagnosis came, he actually became very productive and wrote memoir. Was working right up towards the end. I think, as far as I'm aware, the very last thing he wrote was an essay that appeared in Granta in spring of 2006 called God and Me, about his relationship with the church. Just finally, a word about the book itself, The Letters of John McGahern, and its reception. It's very different from any book I've ever worked on before. I've written academic monographs and, enjoyed the work and tried to do my best for the subjects that I was looking at. But as I said already, this is more John McGahern's book than it is mine. So it's naturally attracted a great deal of attention. And it's been reviewed in all of the Irish national dailies. Strangely, it even got into the top 10 of non-fiction hardbacks in the Irish Times early on in its career, which is good for a collection of literary letters. And just this week, it's been named by Roy Foster as his book of the year in the TLS. So things like that are, for me, and I'm sure for you, most of you here are academics, it's a different world to the world of academic publishing. To be working with a company like Faber. The thing it's made clear to me, which I suppose I always knew, is that John McGahern is revered in Ireland. That I think perhaps only Heaney, maybe, of recent writers has a greater affection amongst the public than McGahern. And anywhere I've spoken or about the book over the last few weeks, whether it be in Galway or Ballyshannon or Dublin, I've had people come up to me afterwards who knew him, who had met him. One of the problems, of course, is I would say since the book has been published, I now have a further 15 letters. And more will come. It's inevitable. I always knew that had to happen. That's okay. I mean, I think there's a good range of letters here. There's a good sense of the life. And I also have, fortunately, the safety net of a biography to write. Now, that may drive me mad, but at least if I keep getting material, it'll all help. As for how long that will take, we shall see. But the letters are a start. They give me a good scaffold. I know what John McGahern was doing every month of his adult life. That doesn't mean I'm going to write a great biography. I know a lot of things, but then making that work as a narrative and capturing the spirit of the man is a whole other thing. But that's work for another day. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating and wonderfully delivered presentation about the letters. We've got time now for some questions, so let's just close down the presentation. And okay, just go back to our main screen. So, so how to ask a question? Obviously, people in the room can just raise their hands. Those of you online, on your screen, you should see a little icon at the top with a hand and a face on it. If you click on that and click on the hand icon, that will just kind of digitally raise your hand, and then I'll invite you to ask your question. Just unmute yourself when you're ready. So let's open it up. Yeah, let's start. Okay. Question from the room.
Hey, Sinead.
That was great. Thanks so much. I was really interested in that Charles Monteith letter because of the directness of the communication between writer and publisher. So I was wondering about an agent and how much the agent, took over that kind of communication or not.
Yeah.
Maintain those relationships directly with.
Those early letters between he and Monteith are direct. So Monteith wrote to John McGahern, care of X magazine. So there was no agent, no intermediary then. He had sort of ambivalent relationships with agents. For a period, he had an agent in London, Michael Sissons. Then he got rid of Michael Sissons and decided to go it alone. But there's a definite immediacy with Monteith, that he's dealing with Monteith, not the agent. And so there's lots of letters where he's sort of dealing with royalties, and like, well, Monteith is writing to him, well, you're going to get 10% on the first 2,000 copies and then 12.5% on. So I would say he spent at least half his life without an agent. Yeah. In later years, he took on an American agent with a man called Tim Seldes with Russell and Volkning. He had awful trouble with publishing in America. So first novel, Macmillan, second novel, Knopf, Nightlines, Atlantic, Leave-Taking Atlantic, Little Brown, next book of short stories, Harper and Row, The Pornographer, Harper and Row. Then he switches from Harper and Row and he goes to Viking Penguin for Amongst Women. He doesn't think they're doing a great job. At that point, he gets involved with an agent, and Seldes pushes him towards Knopf, and he has a happy relationship with Knopf for the last sort of 15 years of his life, and the books sell well. But it's an interesting story. And the letters, like a lot of the letters, are about publishing. What do books look like? Where are we going to sell them? How have they sold? What are the royalties? And he had a very hands-on approach to that. And I guess a lot of that is, as you suggest, because there isn't an intermediary a lot of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, Eamon.
Thanks, Ryan. This is one of my Christmas treats and prospects. So what I've seen of it so far, it is a brilliant edition. And maybe majority McGahern, but your contribution is vital to it. And one of the things that I've long thought about is actually the impact of the banning of the dark on McGahern. In Memoir, for instance, he turns it almost into a joke, because his trade union rep points out that, if it was just the odd book, it would be all right. But the woman as well, that's what was the high motion for the union here to represent. But I was just wondering, really, particularly as you talk about how revered he is in his later years, Memoir does seem to downplay quite a lot of things that he'd been very severe about earlier in his career. And there seems to be a deliberate softening and attempt at reconciliation on his part, at a time when he doesn't really need to do it. And I just wonder what sense you have of really what the impact of the banning was.
Okay, for those of you out there in cyberspace, the question is about the impact of the banning of the dark on McGahern. He does downplay it in memoir, but then again, he downplays his entire adult life in memoir. You know, I was just saying to Peter earlier on, memoir is about 85% childhood. And then it's sort of a quick sprint to the line, and then I became famous, the end. You know, boom, boom, boom. He says almost nothing about his writing life in memoir. And you're right, he does downplay the dark, or the banning of the dark. It did have an impact on him. I mean, I think that, so the dark is banned in May 65. I haven't tried to fully quantify this yet, but I don't think he finished anything then for at least 2 years, maybe 3 years. The guts of 3 years, he really did hit a kind of writer's block. So it had a very serious effect on him as a writer. And it was, you know, he downplays it, but, you know, talking to people who remember that time, I've met a few people and spoken to them, it broke his heart to be banned. You know, he was in tears. And I think it's important to him to see him in later years for it not to have so much effect on him. You know, he doesn't want to give in to those who banned it. And so I can understand him wanting to downplay it, but I think it did have a very serious effect on him as a writer that I think could have been terminal if it hadn't been for a couple of other fortunate things that happened to him around about 67, particularly his meeting with Madeline Green. But yeah, it's in a way, it's easy to downplay something when you've come out the far side of it and you've been a success. I think if you'd met John McGahern in say the summer of 1967, he wouldn't have been downplaying the banning of the dark.
One of the sense of memoir is, and the downplaying of the memoir is actually that it's a deep hurt that he doesn't want to return to. But it is a deep. I agree with that. It is a deep hurt, and he became physically unwell writing the dark. He found it extremely difficult to write, but he had to get it over that hump. He had to say what he needed to say in the dark, and I think that it's far from his favorite book, looking back, but he had to write it, but it nearly broke him. I mean, he was physically unwell. He had to take time away from his job at school and so on as he was writing it, and you see him make reference to that in a number of letters.
Okay, thanks, Eamon. Just a reminder to people online, you can ask questions as well. You just need to press the hand icon, or if you're having difficulty with the technology, just unmute yourselves and shout out your question as well. So, Eamon.
Yeah, I'll take this off for a moment. There is an apocryphal story that Colin Tobin described him as an old blue shirt at one stage. This may or may not be true, but perhaps the more important point is, or question really, does he comment on contemporary Irish politics, you know, through the letters, through his lifetime, or was it largely incidental to?
Yeah. Again, the question for those of you out there, if you didn't hear it, is about McGahern's politics and whether he comments on politics. The only consistent political position he takes in the letters is his dislike of Charles Haughey. I mean, he was definitely opposed to you know, violent republicanism. You know, he was very disturbed by the Enniskillen Remembrance Day bombing, say. He was very disturbed by the killings that were going along the border, and he lived very close to the border. And, you know, Enniskillen became, for a period, their main shopping town, and Blake's of the Hollow, the bar in Enniskillen, became his favourite pub. So he was in that period in the 80s, he definitely was someone who had faith in Garrett Fitzgerald and then subsequently John Bruton and no faith in Charles Haughey, who he felt was a crook. And he says that in a number of letters. But he doesn't have much to say about politics. That's the only consistent strain that you see throughout the letters about contemporary Irish politics.
Right, maybe I might ask a question. Writers' families are notoriously defensive of the reputation of their relatives. How have you found working with McGahern's family? You mentioned Dimna's sister in a lot of letters, and his widow as well. How have you found that in general?
Well, the estate, the McGahern literary estate, essentially is Madeleine and a number of people that she's appointed to advise her. And my relationship with Madeleine has been terrific from the start, and has been crucial to starting and finishing the book, and is crucial to writing the biography now. Madeleine is 87, she's in good health. She's got astonishing recall of her life with McGahern. John's surviving sisters, he has 3 surviving sisters, have a greater desire to remain in the background. I am in touch with one of his sisters, Monica, a little bit, who answers questions for me. But it's really it's Madeleine who's been the driving force behind getting this book out, and it was Madeleine who first suggested that I try to write the biography. That was not on the cards at all originally. But we came to know and like and trust each other sufficiently over the years that it started to seem like the obvious thing to try to do, is to write the biography. So I've been very, very lucky. I mean, almost uniquely lucky in my access to Madeleine, her memories, and the vast store of papers that she still holds. And there are so many papers also in Galway which are open to the researcher. So, writing the biography, the problem will be cutting. There's any amount of material. There are still mysteries. Who was the girl in Belfast when he was 17? I don't know. I mean, I find it hard to believe. Did he make that up? Anyway, I'd love to know. And there are a few little questions like that I haven't been able to answer. Most of the issues that arise in the letters I was able to answer, but there are still some mysteries. And there's still some access that I'd like to have that I haven't had yet. But, that work is ahead of me. Yeah.
That's Frank. Okay, do we have any questions from anyone online? Anyone desperate to make a contribution? All gone very quiet out there. Anna, yes, please. So Anna, we can't hear you at the moment. No, we can't hear you. Sorry.
Is it possible to write a comment?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm sorry, Anna. You're muted there. Do you have access to the? You don't know. There must be some way of getting it. Yeah, sorry, that's really frustrating. I mean, you could write it up and hold it up on a card for us. Carrier pigeon, yeah, that might be the way of doing it.
Paul.
Paul's. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Hey, excellent. Really enjoyed the presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm calling from Southeast Connecticut, but this is not a Connecticut accent. I just wondered if he had communicated with 2 of my favorite authors, William Trevor and J.G. Farrell, over the years. Thanks.
So the question is, do I have any evidence of communication with William Trevor or J.G. Farrell? And the answer is no, I don't have any evidence of communication with either of those writers. I can't say for certain that he didn't, but I would be very surprised if he did. All of John's close friends were not writers. And you know, there are writers that he stays in touch with, you know, Heaney, Friel a little bit, Muldoon, Michael McClaverty, but I haven't found any evidence of him writing to Trevor or J.G. Farrell, and nor do I know if he read or admired their work. There's no mention of them in any letter, but that doesn't necessarily mean. I mean, he read extremely widely, but I have no. I'm afraid I can't help you with that. No evidence of letters to them. Sorry, Paul.
Is it working now? I'm trying again.
Yes, Hannah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hooray! It's the new computer. Well, I was just texting Ellen my comment, so she may add to this. I just wanted to thank Frank because he's been really instrumental. Ellen and I are co-editing a new critical edition of Dark, which is out of print in the United States. And Frank has an essay for the volume and has been just really helpful, connected us to Ellen and the estate, and has while he's over there making the letters available, still waiting for them for the U.S. We have to get them smuggled in across the water. They're not published yet. He's also an international man of McGahern publishing, helping back in print or here. And I think it's really. If you want to talk about the phenomenon of how, if you know anything about this, how the Dark fell out of print in the U.S., I think it's fascinating because it's probably one of his most taught novels in universities over here. That it's out of print. Sorry, and now my phone rings once again, just now. All right, that's the end of me.
We can hear that. Anna, you're still with us? No? Okay. We'll probably come back to Anna. Ellen, do you want to ask a question?
Sure, yes, I can jump in. Is there feedback with my voice, or can you hear me?
No, we can hear you.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Frank, yes. So Anna and I obviously want to thank you so much for what you contributed to the edition that we're putting out. I think what Anna was trying to say is that the Dark is not available for U.S. readers right now. It's out of print. And so what we're trying to do is put that edition out so that we can teach it in our classrooms, because we find that novel, especially when you're teaching about a legacy of domestic violence in Ireland, actually teaches very well to American audiences. My question, Frank, if it's okay, is about the sort of role of homosexuality in McGahern's writings or in any of the stuff that he worked on. And the reason I'm asking you this is because, you know, I spent some time in the archive a few years ago, and I was really interested in an essay that he wrote on Sean O'Fwellon's Bird Alone. And I'm sure you know that novel, Bird Alone. Maybe you do, yeah. And you know that McGahern had some really interesting things to say about it. And I don't know about that Journal X. I don't know if that was the one, but do you know what there's that journal that came out of Belfast that was from Northern Ireland that was publishing a number of things that couldn't be published in the Republic. And I can't remember if that was that journal or another one, but he had published this really kind of salacious piece about Bird Alone. And you know, I'm also interested in some of the things that come out in the Dark that aren't necessarily about homosexuality, but are about male sexuality. And I was just wondering, in your dealing with the letters, if anything stood out to you that might add to the conversation about what we do with McGahern and sexuality and gender when we teach, say, the Dark, or when we teach his novels now.
Wow, that's a hard question. I mean, first of all, I don't think I know the essay you're talking about, which disturbs me. The Bird Alone essay.
No,
it doesn't appear in Love of the World.
It shouldn't disturb you, because the archive, I mean, even if you've spent years and years in that archive, which you probably have, first, as you know, as you pointed out in your presentation, you have to be able to decode the handwriting, which is next to impossible for some of the stuff. But also you have to dig through it to see, because you know that edition of the book that you put up, it's so funny that he had an issue with that edition of the leaf taking with that cover, because so much of his stuff was advertised like in Playboy. You know, you and I have gone back and forth with what the images we want to use in our collection, but this is like sort of one of those essays that came out in a more sort of underground journal that was coming out of Northern Ireland that had to do with, that was a little edgier, you know, and it was kind of buried in there. And I think the reason I found it is because I was writing a review on Sean O'Fwaylan on a book that had just come out on Sean O'Fwaylan, so I was looking for it. But I don't think, I mean, I really think it's buried in there. I don't think it's like contextualized within anything else. It's just fascinating to me that he was writing about novels that are sort of this, I mean, we don't even read that book anymore. It's rare, I think, that people teach it, but he was fascinated by it. And he was very fascinated with O'Fwaylan's politics, as you were kind of talking about, some, not O'Fwaylan, but politics in general, republicanism. So I'm just curious if other things that came out in the letters that you found gave us any insight as to whether or not he had, you know, maybe progressive feelings about how we approach gender and sexuality in Ireland.
Well, someone actually asked me a couple of days ago by email if I thought that John McGahern was a misogynist. And I said that I don't think that he is. And I said, I think that John McGahern is a misanthrope. I think that John McGahern mainly doesn't like people. Well, maybe that's too much. He's a man who likes to spend time alone. And he is a very exacting judge of writing. So what he doesn't like about Sean O'Fwaylan's Bird Alone is that it's not good enough as writing. And he's very severe on O'Fwaylan, actually, in general. In terms of your question, one of the things he doesn't like about O'Fwaylan, he feels that O'Fwaylan and O'Connor, one of the crimes that he holds up is that they, for instance, didn't take Kate O'Brien seriously. And he loves Kate O'Brien, and you know, he teaches Kate O'Brien, especially the Anti-Room. Now, whether then you can say something more broadly about sexuality or progressiveness, I don't know. I mean, he has very good working relationships with, you know, women editors. So Frances Kiernan at the New Yorker, Fran McCulloch at Harper and Row. So I know you didn't ask me, or you didn't say that McGahern was a misogynist, but someone did there the other day, and I said, no, I don't think he's a misogynist. I'm going to have to come back to you tomorrow, Ellen, about that essay, because I'm intrigued by that. And I mean, the only journals I can think of that maybe that appeared in, you're talking about a Northern Irish journal, would be the Honest Ulsterman or Threshold. But I just don't know the essay.
I need to look at my notes, and I can also contact Barry, because I know Barry Houlihan could find it immediately for us.
Okay, that'd be very interesting.
Yep, do that.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think more about that, Ellen. But I mean, I think McGahern was a progressive character. I mean, I think that he wanted a more liberal, secular Ireland than the one that he had grown up in. You know, he was a fan of Mary Robinson, for instance. You know, someone asked me in a question earlier on, I don't know if you heard it, that there's an apocryphal story that Colm Tóibín described McGahern as an old blue shirt. Now, I think McGahern is probably voted Fine Gael. Now, if that makes you a blue shirt, fair enough. I don't think he was a fascist. I'm pretty sure he wasn't a fascist. You know, he's a liberal. He is a liberal, and his banning and how he dealt with it is a very important moment in the emergence of a modern, liberal, secular Ireland. That's all I can say for now. But let's talk again about the Bird Alone essay, okay?
Okay, thanks, Ellen and Anna. And sorry we've had some audio problems there, but I think you got your point across effectively. So do we have any other questions, either online or from anyone in the room to contribute? No? Okay. Well, oh, sorry. Yeah, we do. Peter McLaughlin.
Hi, can you hear me okay, Peter? Yeah?
Yeah, speak up, Peter.
Okay, sorry. Thanks very much for the presentation, Frank. And just following up on that point, and I think your computer was, or the communication was breaking a bit down when you talked about his faith and how it wasn't necessarily the banning which led, or singularly the banning which led to the breakdown in his faith. So maybe you could just say a couple of points about that, about what was it? I mean, I presume that was still central to it, but just to augment what you were saying there, because it got lost a little bit when you were talking about his faith and how that features in his thinking.
Okay, so the question is about his faith. I think McGahern lost his faith in the same way that many people lose their faith. And he describes this in this very late essay, God and Me, where it just slowly went away. And one day he woke up and he didn't believe in God anymore. And that happens to lots of people. I was actually surprised to see him in 1962 talking about going to Mass a lot and praying to try and recover from a broken heart as a result of a love affair. I was surprised he was still going to Mass regularly in 1962. So I don't think that the banning really accelerated his loss of faith. I think, and he says again and again, and I believe him, that he wasn't bitter about the church. That the church, he has this wonderful phrase, he says, the church was the early weather of my life. That the church informed him in part, that the church was his first exposition to beauty, the flowers on the altar, his time as an altar server, stained glass windows, all of that. Now, he did not believe in God at his death, but he made sure to have a Catholic funeral. And he left very strict burial instructions to Father Liam Kelly, the man who celebrated the funeral mass, about how the mass ought to be conducted. And he's buried in Ahawillan churchyard beside his mother. So I do believe that he did not believe in God, but it's a bit like James Joyce, you know, he's super saturated in Catholicism. But as to when he actually lost his faith, I don't know. I would guess about 1963.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks for your question, Peter. Anyone else? Okay, well, we might draw things to a conclusion there for this afternoon. So thank you very much, Frank, for coming over from Liverpool to share with us your insights into John McGahern and his letters. The book is available, obviously, from all good booksellers online and in bricks and mortar. And the authorised biography will be appearing in about 2024 or 25.
We'll see. I'm not going to promise anything.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah.
Anyway, so look, can we thank Frank in the traditional fashion by giving him a round of applause? And just before everyone goes.